My name is Claire Whitfield, and for 31 years, I believed my family loved me. I believed that blood meant loyalty, that the people who shared my last name would never look at me the way strangers do, like something to be used, then discarded. I was wrong. And it took losing everything to learn just how wrong I was. This is the story of how my two brothers took the money, the house, and the family business right out from under me the week our grandfather died. They thought they'd won. They thought I was too broken, too grieving, too naive to fight back. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, except one tired old lawyer and a locked drawer in a farmhouse 200 miles away, was that our grandfather had already made sure I would never truly lose. He left me 70 acres. And that 70 acres would end up being worth more than everything they stole combined. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand who my grandfather was before you understand what he did. Harold Whitfield built Whitfield Lumber and Supply from nothing. He was 17 when he started hauling wood scraps in a borrowed truck, and by the time he was 40, he owned 3 lumber yards across the county. He wasn't a soft man. He didn't hand out affection easily. But he was fair. Brutally, unshakably fair. And he had a saying he repeated to us every single Sunday dinner of our childhood. The one who works quiet is the one who's watching. Don't ever mistake silence for weakness. I was the quiet one. My brothers, Marcus and Dean, were not. Marcus was the oldest, loud, and charming, the kind of man who could sell sand in a desert and make you thank him for it. Dean was the middle child, sharper, colder, always calculating 3 steps ahead. And then there was me, Claire, the youngest, the one who actually showed up at the lumberyard every Saturday morning since I was 12 years old, sweeping floors, learning the inventory system, memorizing supplier contracts while my brothers were out chasing whatever version of fun didn't involve dust on their shoes. Grandpa noticed. He always noticed. He just never said it out loud, not until it was almost too late. Grandpa Harold passed away on a Tuesday in October. Heart failure, sudden, no long goodbye. No final words captured on a hospital bed like in the movies. Just a phone. The funeral was small. Family, a few old business partners, the woman who'd run his front office for 22 years crying harder than any of us. I remember standing at the graveside thinking that the ground swallowing that casket was swallowing the last person who had ever truly seen me. I didn't know yet that he'd seen more than I imagined. 3 days after the funeral, my brothers called a family meeting at the house, Grandpa's house, the one he'd lived in since before any of us were born, the one with the wraparound porch and the oak tree he'd planted the year our mother was born. Marcus sat at the head of the table, Grandpa's old chair, like he'd already measured himself for the seat. We talked to Uncle Ray, Marcus said, referring to our grandfather's brother, a man none of us had seen more than twice a year. He says since there's no formal will on file with the county, the estate defaults to us as next of kin. Dean and I are going to handle the business and the house. You'll get your share, obviously. Your share. Like I was a shareholder being politely informed of a dividend. Like I hadn't spent 19 years of Saturdays in that lumber yard while they were nowhere to be found. What about the will? I asked. Grandpa always said he had one drawn up. I should have smelled it right then. The urgency. The way they wouldn't look at me directly. The way Marcus's foot kept tapping under the table like he was sitting on something he desperately wanted to stand up and grab. But grief makes you slow. Grief makes you want to believe the people crying next to you at a funeral wouldn't lie to your face 3 days later. So I signed what they put in front of me. A temporary estate management agreement, they called it. Just to keep things running, they said, until everything got sorted out properly with a real attorney. I trusted them enough not to read every line. That was my first mistake. Within 6 weeks, the lumberyard's ownership had been transferred entirely into Marcus and Dean's names. The house was sold, not divided, not discussed, just sold, to a developer who wanted to tear it down and build townhomes. The oak tree Grandpa planted for our mother came down with a chainsaw on a Thursday morning while I was at work. I found out about the house sale from a neighbor, not my own brothers. When I called Marcus, screaming, asking how they could do this without even telling me, he sighed like I was the unreasonable one. Claire, you signed the papers. You agreed to let us manage the estate. We made the decisions that made sense financially. You got your cut, $40,000, which is more than fair for someone who wasn't even an owner on paper. I asked about the business. Dean's answer was worse. The business needed restructuring anyway. You've got no formal ownership stake, Claire. You were just an employee, technically. We appreciate everything you did, but this is bigger than sentiment now. Marcus and I are the ones taking the financial risk going forward. Just an employee. 19 years, reduced to a job title on a tax form. I remember sitting in my car outside my apartment that night, engine off, hands still on the wheel, feeling something crack open in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was betrayal, sharpened into something with edges. I didn't cry. I'd done enough crying at the funeral. This time, I just sat there and thought about Grandpa's voice. The one who works quiet is the one who's watching. I decided, right there in that car, that I was done being quiet in the way they assumed. I was going to start watching instead. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, maybe just proof, maybe just some paper trail that would let me understand how my whole inheritance had evaporated so cleanly. What I found instead was a name. Feldman and Whitcomb, attorneys at law. Dean had said the office was closed and the attorney retired with no forwarding address. But property records from 12 years earlier showed a small parcel of land, 70 acres out near Route 9, an area everyone in the family used to call the backland, a stretch of overgrown fields Grandpa occasionally drove out to on Sundays, alone, telling no one why. The deed had been filed by Feldman and Whitcomb. I found a current address for a law office 2 counties over. Feldman had apparently sold his old practice but stayed in the business under a new firm name. I called. I explained who I was. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then the receptionist said words that changed everything. Ms. Whitfield, Mr. Feldman has been expecting to hear from you. He said if anyone ever called with that name, to schedule them immediately. I sat across from Arthur Feldman 3 days later, in an office that smelled like old paper and coffee that had been reheated too many times. He was maybe 75, sharp-eyed despite his age, and he looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. Your grandfather came to me 11 years ago, he said. He told me something I never forgot. He said, Marcus and Dean will take whatever isn't nailed down the second I'm gone. Claire will be the only one who doesn't ask for anything, so I have to make sure she gets something they can't touch. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a will, a real one, properly executed, witnessed, notarized, filed in a separate county specifically so it wouldn't be found by a casual record search at the local courthouse. It named me, Claire Whitfield, as the sole owner of 70 acres of land off Route 9. 70 acres of empty field, I said, trying not to laugh at the cruelty of it. Marcus and Dean took the house, the business, and everything in the bank. Grandpa left me dirt. Feldman didn't smile exactly, but something in his face shifted, like a man who'd been holding a secret so long it had started to feel like a physical weight. Claire, he said, have you not seen the news out of Route 9 this year? He turned his computer screen toward me. A regional infrastructure announcement, 6 months old. The state had approved a new logistics corridor and distribution hub, connecting a major highway expansion directly through that exact stretch of land. 3 national retail chains had already signed preliminary agreements to build regional warehouses there. Land values along that corridor had jumped, according to the article, over 11 times their previous worth in less than a year. Grandpa hadn't given me dirt. He'd given me the single most valuable piece of undeveloped land in the entire county, and he'd known it was coming years before anyone else did, because Harold Whitfield never did anything, not once in his life, without 3 steps of foresight nobody else bothered to walk. He told me once, Feldman said quietly, that he'd rather leave you something small that would grow into everything, than something big that your brothers would only shrink into nothing. I want to tell you I handled the next part with grace. I didn't. I drove straight to the lumberyard, Marcus and Dean's lumberyard now, their new sign already up, their names already stenciled on the office door, and I walked in without knocking. They were mid-conversation with a supplier, laughing about something, comfortable in a way that made my skin crawl. We need to talk, I said. Now. Marcus rolled his eyes, told the supplier he'd call him back, and gestured for me to sit like he was doing me a favor. I didn't sit. I spoke to Feldman, I said. The room went cold in a way I could actually feel. Dean's jaw tightened first. Dean always gave himself away before Marcus did. You told me his office was closed, I said. You told me there was no will. You lied to my face 3 days after we buried him. Marcus tried to recover, tried the charm that had worked on every supplier and half the women in 3 counties. Claire, look, We didn't lie exactly, we just... Grandpa left me the 70 acres out on Route 9, I said. You know, the land you two used to call worthless. The land you didn't even bother listing when you split everything else up, because you figured it wasn't worth the paperwork. I watched something flicker behind Dean's eyes, the beginning of understanding, the kind that comes right before real fear. That land is part of the new logistics corridor, I said. It's worth more right now than the house, the business, and every dollar you two split between yourselves, combined. Grandpa knew it was coming. He knew you'd take everything you could see. So he made sure the one thing you couldn't see was the only thing that mattered. Marcus actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark. That's, Claire, that can't be right, we would have known if. You didn't know, I said, because you never once, in your entire lives, thought to ask what I knew, what I was watching, or what Grandpa might have told the quiet one when he stopped trusting the loud ones. I won't pretend the next year was simple. Grief doesn't resolve itself just because justice shows up late. There were lawyers, there were arguments, there was a bitter, ugly stretch where Marcus tried to claim the temporary estate agreement I'd signed somehow covered the Route 9 land too, until his own attorney quietly told him it legally couldn't, because the land had never been part of the estate they controlled. It had already been separately willed to me over a decade before Grandpa died. There was one afternoon I still remember more clearly than almost any other. Marcus showed up at my apartment unannounced, no charm left in his voice at all, just a raw, cornered kind of desperation. You have to split it with us, he said, standing in my doorway like he still had the right to demand anything from me. We are family, Claire. Whatever happens with that land, we built this family's business together. It's not right for you to walk away with all of it. I almost laughed. Almost. You didn't think it was family when you sold the house without calling me. You didn't think it was family when Dean told me I was just an employee after 19 years of Saturdays. Where was this speech about fairness 6 weeks ago, Marcus? He didn't have an answer. He never did, not really. Marcus's whole life had been built on momentum, on talking fast enough that nobody had time to ask the follow-up question. But I'd stopped being someone who let a conversation move faster than the truth. You're not getting a percentage of my land, I told him. You got your share. $40,000, remember? That's what you decided was fair. I'm simply agreeing with your own math. He left angrier than he'd arrived, and Dean stopped calling entirely after that, which told me everything I needed to know about which brother had actually been driving the whole scheme from the start. Word travels fast in small county, especially when it involves a family everyone thought they understood. People started talking, quietly at first, then not so quietly. The same neighbors who'd watched that oak tree come down started mentioning, almost gleefully, how the smart Whitfield sister had ended up with the one piece of property nobody else had wanted to bother fighting over. Uncle Ray, the same relative who'd supposedly told my brothers the estate defaulted to them with no will on file, eventually admitted to me over an awkward, stilted phone call that he'd never actually looked into it himself. He'd simply repeated whatever Marcus told him to repeat, because it was easier than getting involved. That was the moment I understood how much of my brother's entire plan had been built on nothing but confidence, and the assumption that grief would keep everyone else too tired to check. 3 logistics companies eventually approached me directly. I didn't rush. I remembered Grandpa's voice again. The one who works quiet is the one who's watching. I took meetings. I read every line of every contract myself, the way I used to read supplier agreements at the lumberyard on quiet Saturday mornings nobody else showed up for. I sold 20 acres to the highest bidder for a number that still makes my hands shake when I say it out loud. I leased the remaining 50 to a distribution company on a contract that pays me more every single year than the lumberyard ever earned in profit under my grandfather's management. Marcus and Dean's business, meanwhile, started struggling within 18 months. Turns out charm and calculation don't replace 19 years of actually knowing how a lumberyard runs. 2 of their biggest suppliers, the ones I'd built relationships with for nearly 2 decades, quietly moved their business elsewhere once they realized who was actually running things now. I heard, secondhand, that Marcus eventually called Feldman's office himself, asking if there was any other paperwork, any other secret, anything else Grandpa might have hidden that he'd missed. Feldman told him the same thing he told me on the day I sat in his office for the first time. Harold Whitfield only had one secret left to give, he said, and he gave it to the only person who never asked for anything. I still think about my grandfather almost every day. Not with anger anymore. That faded once I stopped needing my brothers to understand what they'd lost. I think about him mostly with something closer to gratitude, and a strange kind of awe. He watched all three of us for years, quietly, the way he always told us to. He knew exactly who would take the money and run, and exactly who would stay long enough to inherit something far more valuable than money. But every morning, I drive out to Route 9 and stand at the edge of the 50 acres I still own, watching trucks roll toward the distribution hub that didn't exist 2 years ago, and I think about a quiet old man who never said "I love you" out loud in his entire life, but who spent his last decade making absolutely sure that the daughter who showed up, the granddaughter who showed up, would never, ever be left with nothing. My brothers took the money. They took the house. They took the business, and they took it without a single moment's hesitation, without a single thought for what fairness might have looked like. In the end, the 70 acres he left me wasn't just land. It was proof that he saw me, all along. And that, more than any number in any bank account, is the inheritance I actually keep.